It was a calm night as Flight 762 departed from Seattle, heading toward Denver. The weather forecast was clear, visibility good, and the crew was well rested. Captain Mark Reynolds, a seasoned pilot with over 15 years of experience, sat in the left seat, while First Officer Dana Collins handled the right. The flight seemed routine, one of those uneventful journeys where pilots expected little more than a smooth ride and a timely landing. But as the night wore on, a chain of small mistakes and technical failures would push them into a situation that neither of them had ever faced before. The takeoff went smoothly, and the aircraft climbed steadily to cruising altitude. The passengers relaxed, the cabin lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines filled the silence. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But somewhere over the Rockies, just as the plane crossed into a region known for unpredictable weather and spotty radar coverage, the flight management system began to flicker. A warning message briefly flashed across the cockpit screens, then vanished. Captain Reynolds frowned but didn't think much of it. Avionics sometimes glitched. They usually reset on their own. A few minutes later, the first sign of real trouble appeared. The aircraft's GPS feed began giving inconsistent readings. The digital map on the main display showed the plane veering slightly off course, then correcting itself, then veering again. Dana tried recalibrating the system, but the coordinates kept jumping. She cross-checked with the backup navigation display, but it too was showing strange data. Reynolds decided to rely on manual navigation and radio beacons, but soon even those signals began to weaken. At first, they assumed it was just interference. The Rocky Mountains were notorious for blocking radio signals. But within 10 minutes, they realized something far more serious was happening. They had lost positional awareness. The plane's navigation systems had failed completely, and both the primary and backup instruments were giving contradictory information. The autopilot tried to correct based on false readings, causing the aircraft to drift slightly north of its intended route. They contacted air traffic control, but communication was patchy. Static drowned out most of their transmissions, and they could barely hear the controller's responses. The radar couldn't even confirm their position clearly, just an intermittent blip among the mountain terrain. The crew tried to orient themselves using visible landmarks, but at 33,000 feet under a moonless sky, everything below was pitch black. The only lights visible were the stars above, and the faint glow of distant towns hidden behind layers of cloud. For all they knew, they could be flying directly toward a mountain range or clear sky. The instruments told conflicting stories, and the pilot's instincts began to clash with the data in front of them. Minutes turned into an hour, the tension in the cockpit thickened. Reynolds manually adjusted heading and altitude to what he estimated was the safest route. The aircraft was descending slightly to escape turbulence, but the clouds grew thicker and the wind stronger. Rain began to tap against the cockpit windows, the first sign of an approaching storm. Suddenly, a loud alarm blared a terrain warning. The screen flashed red, terrain, pull up. The pilots jolted in shock. They hadn't seen anything ahead, but the warning meant one thing: they were dangerously close to the ground. Reynolds yanked the control column, pushing the engines to maximum thrust. The aircraft climbed sharply, the engines roaring as G-forces pressed them into their seats. The warning stopped after a few seconds, but the adrenaline kept them shaking. Dana's hands trembled as she checked the altitude. "That doesn't make sense," she said quietly. "We should still be well above the terrain." Reynolds didn't respond. He knew that something was deeply wrong. They weren't where they thought they were. With GPS down, radar unreliable, and visual references non-existent, they were flying blind in one of the most dangerous regions in the country. Every second counted. The captain instructed Dana to attempt contact with any nearby control center. After several tries, they managed to reach a regional ATC out of Salt Lake City. The controller could barely hear them, but one phrase cut through clearly: "You're off course, turn east immediately." Reynolds complied. The aircraft banked sharply, the wings cutting through heavy rain. Lightning illuminated the sky for brief moments, revealing dark, jagged shapes below mountains. For the first time that night, both pilots realized how close they had come to disaster. They were flying deep into the Rockies, far from their intended route, surrounded by peaks that reached over 14,000 feet high. The air grew turbulent, the cockpit rattled violently, and for a few seconds the aircraft's lights flickered. They were now flying through the heart of a storm. The instruments went haywire again, displaying conflicting readings of altitude and airspeed. Dana switched to stand by indicators, but even those seemed unreliable. Panic began to creep in as they realized they no longer knew their exact altitude relative to the terrain. The captain tried to climb higher to clear the storm, but the engines strained. The MD-83 wasn't designed to handle aggressive climbs in such conditions. The storm battered them with crosswinds, forcing Reynolds to fight the controls just to keep the aircraft level. They could hear hail pounding the fuselage, sounding like bullets on metal. Minutes later, as the storm eased slightly, visibility returned just enough to reveal a faint outline in the distance, a massive, shadowy form rising from the darkness. At first, they thought it was a cloud. But as the seconds passed, it took shape. A mountain, tall, black, and terrifyingly close. Reynolds froze. "That's a mountain," he whispered, disbelief in his voice. Dana's eyes widened in horror. They had no idea they were this close to terrain. The warning systems hadn't even gone off this time. They had been flying directly toward it without realizing. He immediately banked left, pushing the engines to maximum thrust again. The plane tilted sharply, passengers screaming in the cabin as the force threw them sideways. The mountain loomed outside the cockpit window, its rocky face illuminated briefly by lightning. For a terrifying few seconds, it seemed inevitable that they would collide, but the aircraft cleared the slope just barely. The altimeter spun rapidly as they gained height, the terrain falling away beneath them. The mountain passed under the left wing by what felt like mere meters. The cockpit was silent except for the sound of their heavy breathing. Once clear, the captain steadied the aircraft and leveled off at 20,000 feet. Both pilots sat in silence, shaken but alive. They had no idea where exactly they were, only that they had just escaped a fatal crash. Dana managed to re-establish brief contact with ATC. The controller's voice was clearer this time. "You're now over western Colorado. Maintain heading 18. We'll vector you to Denver." Relief washed over them. They were finally being guided back toward safety. The rest of the flight was tense but uneventful. As they approached Denver, the navigation systems began to recover. The airport lights appeared on the horizon like a promise of salvation. When the wheels finally touched down, the cabin erupted in applause, but inside the cockpit, neither pilot celebrated. When they parked at the gate, the captain sat motionless for a long moment. He finally said quietly, "We almost didn't make it." Dana nodded, her hands still trembling. Later investigations revealed that a software malfunction had caused the GPS to lose satellite lock, while simultaneous electromagnetic interference from a nearby storm disrupted backup navigation. The terrain warning system had activated too late because of a faulty sensor calibration. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, and yet, through sheer instinct and experience, the pilots had saved everyone on board. The passengers never truly understood how close they came to tragedy. The official report would describe it as a navigation anomaly, but in reality, it was something far more chilling, a story of a crew that had no idea where they were until they saw a mountain. For months afterward, both pilots replayed that night in their minds. The image of that dark mountain looming through the rain would never leave them. Every time they flew over the Rockies again, they couldn't help but glance out the cockpit window, searching the darkness for the shadow that had nearly taken their lives. In aviation, it's said that most accidents don't come from one big mistake, but from a series of small ones, minor oversights, slight misjudgments, small technical faults that build until the situation spirals out of control. That night was a perfect example. A flickering display, a weak radio signal, a momentary lapse of awareness, and suddenly, two pilots found themselves lost in the sky, with nothing but darkness and instinct to guide them. When Captain Reynolds finally retired years later, that flight remained the one he could never forget. Every detail, the storm, the alarms, the mountain was etched into his memory. He often told young pilots that the most dangerous words in aviation were "everything's fine," because sometimes it's not, and you might not realize it until the moment you see a mountain in the dark. It was a reminder of how fragile control can be, how quickly confidence can turn into chaos, and how survival sometimes depends on nothing more than luck and human instinct. That night, high above the Rockies, two pilots lost their way and found it again only when they came face to face with the mountain that could have ended everything.